Norm and I went to Scotland this last summer, up in the Highlands, and we went to the little town of Aberlour. Famous, I mean whiskey, yes, but also famous because in 1898, Joseph P. Walker opened a bakery and started selling shortbread. Walker shortbread. Yes, I see the nods, yes, in the red plaid tins that we all know and love, Walker shortbread. The factory's still there. They distribute worldwide. The factory's still based in that little town. So of course we wanted to tour the factory. Got tickets. It was in the afternoon. Had time to stop in a local pub for lunch. So we went in, ordered from the bartender, and after we ordered, he said, "So what are you here for to see?" I am lying. What he actually said was, "Sir, what are you here for to see?" So for the rest of the story, I'm just going to do Scottish Light for just all of our comprehension. I said, "Well, we're here to see the shortbread factory." He said, "Oh, well, it's a good thing you're here this week, because they're not making it any longer." I know, my mouth dropped too. What? And Norm said, what is it, like supply chain issues? Is it Brexit? Is there something going on? And then Norm and I we were like, what are we gonna do? Especially, what are we gonna do without the tins? Where are we gonna keep the buttons for all the clothes we've given away? And our expired licenses? And the obsolete charger cords? What are we gonna do? I mean, there was we were just the focus of the pub. We're in distress, and then somebody yells from across the room, "Dougie," to the bartender, "tell them why they're not making it any longer." And Dougie looks us in the eye and says, "'Cause if they made it any longer, it wouldn't be shortbread, would it?" The whole pub erupts, including us. And just as Norm is signaling to Dougie that he should pull himself a wee dram on our bill, we hear this sound, like fingernails on a chalkboard, and we look. It's this old woman sitting by the fireplace. She's got her wooden cane. She's dragging it down the slate. And she looks me in the eye and she says, "You dinna ken what you dinna ken." And Dougie translated, "You don't know what you don't know." And she said, "Back in the war, when times were scarce, you wouldn't be laughing then. You'd be sitting in fear for a knock on the door that signaled the measuring men." She said, "The measuring men, the measuring men." Back in the war, when there was rations, petrol and meat, butter and sugar, and the sheriff of each county was responsible for the rationing, just as we were for levying the taxes and keeping the peace. And the sheriff in this county of Murray was a dour, sore fella named Douglas McLeary. Dreary McLeary, we called him. Oh, he had not an ounce of levity in his body. 'Tweren't enough for Dreary McLeary to control the amount of butter and sugar that went in the household. He had to control what you did with it. I can still remember hearing him as a girl in the public square. "Sugar," said Dreary McLeary, "should be reserved for the fairness of the working man, to ease his labour during the day. And butter should be spread sparingly on the hard tack and the ship's biscuit, to ease it past the cracked lips of the fishermen. It should not be wasted on frippery, like pastry and shortbread." So Dreary McCreary decreed that shortbread in the county of Murray, where we are now, should not exceed the length of 1/2 of a wee ell of an inch, and should not be wider than it was long, or thicker than it was wide. And he sent out squads of deputies to pound on the door of the villages. And when the woman of the house came forward, they say, "Woman, show us your bread box." And they pull out their measuring tapes, their sanctified strings, my granny would call them, and they'd measure the shortbread. And if it exceeded the regulation length, they'd pound it to bits there on the counter and sweep the crumbs into a bag and cart it away with all the butter and sugar in the woman's larder. And soon there wasn't a woman in the county, in the Highlands, that had a scrap of butter or a bit of sugar to call her own. And so the women took counsel together. And I remember being in the church hall at my mom's knee. And old Mother McCairn, Salty McCairn, she was called, she got up to speak. "Women of the Highlands," Mother McCairn said, "idle hands are the devil's workshop. Since we've been denied the supplies we need to do our baking, we must turn our culinary prowess to other pursuits still within our purview. Ladies of the Highlands, I give you haggis." Now, the old woman in the pub did not have to explain to her audience that haggis is a Scottish delicacy made of the pluck of the sheep, a lovely way of describing the innards of the sheep, the lungs, the heart, the liver, all sliced and diced and spiced and wrapped up in the sheep's stomach, where it is served with great gusto. "So," the old woman continued, "the women of the Highlands began to experiment, serving haggis in every possible permutation for every conceivable meal, scrambled for breakfast, swimming in a broth for midday, roasted or seared for the evening meal, and pickled for a midnight snack. And the men of the Highlands began to grumble and grow dour and pasty, even more dour and pasty than they already were. And finally, the haggis experiment reached even the table of dreary McCreary himself, whom, upon being served haggis for the third time in a row, looked across the table at his wife and said, "Have a wee word with the cook." So Mrs. McCleary screwed up her courage, for indeed she feared her cook even though more than she feared her husband. And the next morning she went into the kitchen, and there sat the cook at the table, with her arm around a woman who was sobbing as if her heart would break. And the cook looked up and said, "Aye, Mrs. McCleary, it's me sister, fresh off a visit from the majoring men, and now left without a scrap of butter or a bit of sugar in her larder, and her twin daughter's 12th birthday the day after tomorrow. Aye, Mrs. McCleary, it is too bad when a woman can't choose what to bake in her own oven." And the two women's eyes held, and something passed between them. Mrs. McCleary squared her shoulders and said, "Aye, it is, cook, and I have come to commission another of your signature haggis dishes for my husband's supper tonight. Shall we try it soufflé?" And whether it was the sight of the haggis soufflé that greeted dreary McCleary at his supper table, which was indeed a terrible thing to see, or whether it was the way his wife was glaring at him across the haggis dish, dreary McCreary relented, and the next day issued a proclamation that since the war was over, and had in fact been over for several years, rationing was ended in the county of Murray, including the regulations on the length of the shortbread. "Oh, aye," the old woman said. "Will you look at the time? I must be getting myself home, for didn't I put a batch of shortbread in my own oven before I came down here to the pub for a wee dram? Well, I must be getting it out, because if I let it bake any longer, why, it wouldn't be shortbread."